Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast.
Welcome back to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Don sitting in the host chair today, doing something a little bit unusual, given that for the last couple of months we've had a run here of having either a co-host situation or a multiple host situation on most of the episodes, which is actually what we prefer. And knowing from the feedback that we get from our listeners that it's actually what you prefer too. But today I'm going to be flying the magical What If machine solo. For an episode here that I hope you also find equally entertaining and educational. On today's episode, we're going to look at a historical what if that's one of those what ifs that transitions off of changing a military outcome in history. So often in history, change the battle, change the war, change history. And so we're going to look at one of those types of scenarios today. Actually, one of what might be considered one of the more important battles in all of history in terms of the change that it could have. We're going back for that battle to the heart of Western Europe, and we're going back to the year 732, particularly in October of 732. And so we're going to be looking at what is the potential change in history if we change the outcome of the Battle of Tours. So back in October of 732, we have the conflict between the expanding Islamic forces of the caliphate that are moving up from not only through the Iberian Peninsula, but have now entered into Gaul, what we think of as modern-day France, and they encounter the forces under Charles Martel, the Frankish kingdoms united under Martel, to fight against them at the gates, the entrance to the city of Tours, actually between Tours and Poitiers, there in France. In the real timeline, what we find is that the Franks are successful, the Christian forces, represented by the Franks, are successful under Martel, and the advance of Islamic forces in the caliphate comes to a halt there at the Battle of Tours. As we look at today's alternate history, though, one of the things we're going to talk about is what was the significance, really, of the Battle of Tours, and look at that through a couple of different perspectives. And then certainly, as we do here on A Fork in Time, because that's what the podcast is all about what the historical what-ifs might have been if we changed that outcome. We'll get into that by sort of setting up the historical what did, as we often do. But first, we're going to take a quick break here, hear from some of the folks that help make the show possible. Then we come back, we'll set up the real timeline, and then, of course, our alternate timeline for a different outcome of AD 732's Battle of Tours. We'll be back in just a minute. Alexis and Don here, taking just a quick break from the podcast today to actually talk about the technology that we're using to bring you the podcast. We're going to talk about Buzzsprout, which is where we host A Fork in Time. Now, you may get our podcast via a number of the other podcatchers, the other ways that podcasts are syndicated. So you might be listening on Apple Podcasts, you might be listening on Google Podcasts, you might be listening on Stitcher. But Alexis, where do we post the podcast at?
On Buzzsprout.
On Buzzsprout. When we started A Fork in Time, I got to be honest with you, I guess I'd read a few things. I was familiar with a couple of different podcast hosting sites because I'd heard their names being a podcast listener, but I had no idea what was really going to be involved with setting up a podcast. And I can tell you, it's actually pretty easy. Wouldn't you agree, Alexis?
Yes.
And the reason it's pretty easy that Buzzsprout's there to help you through every part of the process. And so what Buzzsprout is they're not just a hosting service, but they give you suggestions, and they're a platform that really helps podcasts of any size be able to get their word out. In fact, so much so that over 100,000 podcasts actually call Buzzsprout home.
Yep.
And so what we have for our listeners is an opportunity to help support the podcast and also utilize Buzzsprout services. So all you have to do is follow the link in the show notes. And if you do, because you're looking to start a podcast, they'll walk you through, believe me, they'll walk you through very easily on the website what you need to do. And if you choose to move forward there, we actually get a benefit from that. So I think I would call that, what's the word that we use for that, Alexis?
Win-win.
Win-win is the word that we use for that. And again, some of the things that I've already mentioned is we use Buzzsprout. We find it very easy to use. Uploading an episode each week, I think, is
super simple, and they even send you stats every week, which get a little addicting to look at.
I agree with that. In fact, that's another interesting thing that I didn't even, I guess, fully realize as we were starting, that immediately we'd be able to start seeing stats, not only about how many downloads, how many listens, but where in the world people are listening, all of that kind of thing. So it's not just a place to host a podcast, it's really the full support that's there. There's other affiliations that they have that allow either a novice podcaster or an experienced podcaster to get the podcast up and growing. So we don't consider anyone starting a podcast to be a competitor because we're all in this space together. So if you've been thinking about starting a podcast, what would you recommend our listeners do, Lex?
Go to Buzzsprout. It's a good starting point.
I would agree. And so all you need to do is follow the link in our show notes and go there and you'll see what's available for you. So we'd encourage you to do that. So Buzzsprout, it's the home of A Fork in Time, and it could be home of your podcast as well. Welcome back to A Fork in Time. Again, thanks for joining us today. So again, we're going to look at this alternative outcome for the Battle of Tours in 732. Again, setting up the historical what did. The Battle of Tours, it's also sometimes called the Battle of Poitiers. The battle takes place on the road between Tours and Poitiers. We think of today as modern-day France. At that time, still going by the Roman name for the area Gaul. This is also the area of the Franks. So if I use any of those terms interchangeably when we're talking about what is now modern-day France and outside of the city of Tours, but going by a couple of different names. And what we find there is that it's during the invasion of Gaul by the Umayyad caliphate. Islam has spread since its origin in the early 7th century quite rapidly throughout Persia, throughout the Holy Land, across North Africa, up through the Iberian Peninsula into Europe. And now we find Islamic forces are pushing fairly far north, relatively speaking, into the northern part, again, of what we think of as being modern-day France. And so the particular battle here, again, faces those Islamic forces as they are advancing against those forces that are led and organized by the Frankish mayor of the palace and leader of the Frankish military forces, Charles Martel. Martel, of course, is going to gain fame as a result of this battle as being the savior of Christianity, sort of saving the Christendom from the invasion and from the continuing spread of the Islamic forces, which had spread across the world quite rapidly during the first century after the founding of Islam. But we're going to, as we look at the historical what if for today, we're actually going to see that the historical what if really depends a lot upon the historian's view of the historical what did, which I think is what makes it sort of an interesting point of departure. The argument being that changing this battle does little or nothing, which has sort of become more of a modern scholarship position relative to the importance of the battle, what the battle represented, and thus changing the battle has very little outcome. To a more traditional view of the battle, where the battle is given tremendous significance in terms of turning the tide of Islamic expansion into Europe, eventually leading back towards the push back by Christian forces to contain the European expansion of Islam into the Iberian Peninsula, and then ultimately, somewhere on the order of, I guess, approximately 750 years later, finally in 1492 with Cordoba, where eventually Spanish forces known as the Spanish Moors, the Islamic peoples that were in the Iberian Peninsula, are eventually finally removed under Ferdinand and Isabella, completing the expulsion of Islamic influence and Islamic forces from Europe. So we're going to take a look at the historical what if today, looking at both of those perspectives in terms of changing the outcome. So very quickly, the historical what did, not to spend too much time on the military aspects of what is there, although it is important, is that historians sort of take the take that, of course, the battle was won by Charles Martel under leading Frankish warbands, leading the Frankish military to overcome and defeat the Islamic forces, primarily using the benefits of cavalry as part of what was there, but also a much heavier emphasis on infantry, and sort of historically being known from a military tactical sense of using the element of surprise, putting forces where they weren't expected to be, which is actually between the the coming Islamic forces and the city of Tours, and choosing a location for the battle, a place of his choosing, where Martel had the tactical advantage in terms of the way that things laid out on the battlefield. So in the real timeline, the Battle of Tours is a victory for Charles Martel. It's a victory for the Franks over the Islamic forces, and they begin to push back what had been the invasion and the occupation of most of the southern portion of Gaul, Aquitaine, back, and eventually push Islamic forces back to the south side of the Pyrenees and being contained once again to the Iberian Peninsula. That's the real historical what did. Historians take two different views, though, of the significance of that. And again, the latter historical view, something that's actually come to be more of prevalence in late scholarship, is the idea that this was not really, by the time the Muslim forces reach Tours, this is really not anymore the vanguard of an invasion force, but it's sort of a force that's just about reached the extent of how far it can go because of its supplies and its capability and the size of the force and its manpower. It's sort of on the very fringes of its northern expansion as an invasion and as an occupation. And in fact, what's really going on in the effort to move towards Tours is not really an invasion and capture the city, but it really is a raiding party that's actually trying to gather supplies and to pick up the bounty that would have been available, as Tours is a city that is rich in terms of some of the resources that are there, gold and other prizes that could be had by taking the city and seizing those materials from the city. So this newer, sort of more modern scholarship is that what we really don't have here is Tours as being the object as part of an Islamic invasion, as part of the caliphate's invasion into Gaul, but really this is towards the latter end of their northward push, and that really this is just a raiding party, a glorified raiding party that's gone after the city of Tours. And so under that particular view of what actually happened in the historical what did, if you change it, the historical what if, historians would argue, becomes far less significant. If this was not a significant next step in the Islamic invasion and expansion into Europe and moving up through Gaul to permanently seize Gaul, if it really just is sort of the end game of their northern expansion, and it's inevitable that they're going to, because of having stretched their supply lines and not being able to hold the territory that they've been able to seize, that they're going to have to begin the retreat and be pushed back anyway, sort of that the macro forces are going to happen and do what they do anyway, then you diminish the importance of the Battle of Tours. It's just an insignificant, small success in a larger campaign that was already inevitably going to lead towards the Frankish expulsion of caliphate forces out of Gaul and pushing them back into the territory that they would hold and maintain again for the better part of about the next 700 years, slowly being whittled away over time, but they're going to be contained back to the Iberian Peninsula and south of the Pyrenees. So under that particular scenario of the what if, it's a what if, but so what if kind of scenario. The argument that historians would make is this was not such a battle in terms of scale and importance that changing it would have had any effect. Yes, it's important. Yes, it is a representative situation in terms of reversing the particular flow of what had happened up to that point, which was the successful push northward by the caliphate forces, but that this was the end of that. This was their last hurrah, and eventually things were going to start collapsing back towards the south anyway. So under that what if, we could say, yeah, it's a different outcome, but who cares? Because ultimately, while it may have been delayed or may have actually been portrayed or carried out in a different fashion, it really doesn't have a major influence on history. I don't necessarily know for sure because, again, it's tough to get because of the sources that are used. It's tough to actually get facts that are there to sort of unravel whether that's really what it was or whether it was what historians had thought for most of the time since then, that it was a more significant event. So I will quickly argue that if that really is what it was sort of a glorified raiding party that was turned away. Yes, it's significant in the sense that it saved Tours from the devastation and for the things that would have happened there, but in the course of the big flow of history, it's not that important. So I'm not going to spend any more time focusing on that. So let's look at the scenario where it is a much more impactful event. So the traditional thinking about the Battle of Tours is that, again, that it turned the tide of what was the continuing expansion of the Islamic caliphate into Europe, and that as a result, Charles Martel, for example, is proclaimed as sort of the savior of Christianity. He's the champion who rallies the Franks, who are now Christian, following their conversion before by Clovis, as they had been united about a century and a half before. And he's the military leader who has the tactical capability to reverse the invasion. But not only that, but this is an important win and victory for sustaining Christianity as the predominant religion in Europe and for pushing back the expansion of the Islamic forces. And so under that scenario, Charles Martel is the grandfather ultimately of Charlemagne, Charles the Great, who would become the great unifier and founder of the Carolingian Empire. Again, the founder of what we think of as being sort of the modern day concept of France growing out of unifying the Franks. That particular scenario of emphasizing Martel's role in terms of the flow of history and turning the tide and beginning the process of pushing back the Islamic expansion and containing it takes on a much larger and more significant meaning. And so under that scenario, assuming that you change the outcome of the battle now, there may not have been a substantial push further north. You may have had the consolidation of the gains that had happened up to that point by the caliphate forces that had pushed north. But certainly what you have a much more likely scenario of happening is that you gain a foothold by the Islamic caliphate beyond just their foothold in the Iberian Peninsula. Now they are up in the main part of Europe. They're north of the Pyrenees, which had been one of the barriers from the initial expansion, and why it had taken some time for them to actually gather forces and be able to move into Gaul and to make the march northward. But you have a situation where they have now been able to better consolidate their position and their foothold on the European continent. So one of the things that I would argue certainly would have happened if you look at this being a more significant invasion, and while they may have stopped at Tours and not necessarily pushed much further north, may have consolidated their gains with the southern part of France, the area that we know as Aquitaine, is that you would have now had a much larger Islamic presence on the continent. And if that presence sustains itself and settles in over the course of a generation or two, you might see the type of situation now occurring in France that had occurred actually in the Iberian Peninsula. So the ways that we think of Spain before the ultimate rise and the expulsion of finally from the Iberian continent in 1492 of the influence of the Moors, you would have had this same situation that would have occurred in France. And where that's particularly interesting of note is at the same time this is going on, Islamic forces are laying siege to and putting pressure on what had been the eastern half of the Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire. And so you have not only the expansion of the caliphate up through the Iberian Peninsula into Europe, but you have that's the western side of the expansion. But you have the eastern side of the expansion where pressure is being placed upon Constantinople, moving up through what we think of as being modern-day Turkey, and then through the Balkans and up through the eastern portion of Europe, where you could have had a situation where what ultimately could have happened there is the two forces, the western push and the eastern push, might have been able to actually unite or provide support to each other. And so one of the changes that happens if there's not the rolling back of the expansion on the western front, if you will, moving northward here, is that you may have had the consolidation of that and now the ability to change some of the outcome on the eastern front of the war. It's not going to be until the 15th century, actually, that Constantinople falls, where the eastern half of the Roman Empire ceases to exist and actually does ultimately fall to Islamic forces, what eventually comes into being the Ottoman Empire, what we think of as modern-day Turkey. But that is still 600 to 700 years removed from the events of where we are now. But we have Constantinople sort of barely holding on in the early part of the 8th century, just ahead of the Battle of Tours. And so if you change the outcome of the Battle of Tours, not only are you potentially changing the outcome for Islamic expansion into Western Europe, particularly Southwestern Europe, but you have the potential of changing the flow of what happens with the Islamic expansion in the eastern part of Europe. And so if you think about the impact of what that could be, isolating the territories that are in the middle, Italy, what we think of today as being modern Germany, sort of these other territories that would fall between the two, you have the possibility that you actually have a large Islamic empire that is able to join up and now basically uh, subsumes and controls most of what had been previous area when the Roman Empire was at its peak. And if you think that through, that's a very different course for Europe. Most notably under that scenario, sort of in the short-term timeline, it's actually thinking through what will happen basically in about 70 years in the real-time line when Charles Martel's grandson, who becomes again Charlemagne, Charles the Great, actually reunites and continues to expand on the united idea of a united Frankish kingdom, eventually becoming the Carolingian Empire. And Charlemagne gains control of most of Central Europe, modern day France, the areas of Germany, moving on from there. And also, during that particular period of time, is able to placate some of the previous barbarian tribes, the other Germanic tribes that were giving difficulties for the papacy is still that's residing there in Rome. The Lombards, for example, eventually investing over to the papacy, the papal states. And we have the relationship that exists between the Franks and between the Catholic Church and the papacy in terms of, which is sort of best represented by the coronation of Charlemagne on Christmas Day in December of the year 800, when he is crowned by the Pope Leo III as the Emperor of Rome, the Holy Roman Emperor, basically the successor to what had been the western part of the Roman Empire. And so what we have there is, because of what had happened previously with his grandfather Charles Martel and his success in terms of maintaining a Christian influence, Christian control, pushing back the forces of Islam, containing them back to the Iberian Peninsula, creating a more unified, Christianized central part of Europe connected to Orthodox Christianity at that point in the terms of Nicene Orthodox Christianity that's represented in the Western Church centered with the Pope in Rome, and this relationship that grows where the Franks are supporting the papacy's role, the papacy is supporting the role of the Franks and the kingdom there in such a way that we eventually lead to what we recognize as being the normal flow of European history, which is up until the Reformation and the things that happen as a result of that. We have essentially a unified Catholic Church, a Christian influence that is consistent throughout most or all of Europe, including the various missionary activities that go to bring Christianity and expand Christian influence into the Nordic and Scandinavian territories, continue to allow it to thrive in the area of the British Isles, and this idea of a unified Christian Europe that we know so well from the original timeline, from the real-time flow of history. So now there's a couple of different paths we can look at as being the divergence there. One of them is just thinking through what that means for the survival of, if you will, the Latin form of Christianity. I'm going to argue very strongly here that we would not see, just because of the rise or the expansion of an Islamic caliphate into more of Europe, that we would see Christianity disappear, or that it would totally be lost. I'm not going to argue that. I don't believe that is likely the case, but certainly there would be a different flavor of the Christianity that would survive, and that would be a different flavor in a couple of different ways. So one of the first things to think about is, let's assume, and again we have to sort of define what the what-if's going to be here to work down this path. Let's assume that there is an Islamic caliphate that is able to grow and expand and actually subsumes most of the southern half of Europe, links across, whether it actually ends the reign or influence of Constantinople or the Byzantine Empire, but it certainly links together in such a way that it endures and lasts inside of southern Europe, and essentially creates a circle around the area that we think of as being modern-day Italy, and so around the home of the Western Church, represented by the Pope in Rome. So under that scenario, while it's difficult to know whether that would have actually allowed the Pope to remain in Rome and that there would not have been just ultimately as the result of the Islamic influence there, just the removal of that part of the church. But certainly what you would have seen is you would have seen an isolated Latin Christianity that would no longer be easily centered in Rome or with a much smaller influence than it ultimately did have in the real timeline as it interacted with Charlemagne and the others who allowed it to grow and expand into Europe. And so what you would have left of the Western branch of Christianity would be what is existing in the British Isles, the things that had happened, were really just about this time and slightly after this, were the conversion of the Vikings and some of the other Scandinavian Nordic peoples to Christianity. And so you would have had that form of Christianity that had been the Western form of Christianity now contained very much to Northern Europe and to the British Isles. And so while it's possible to believe that eventually there would have been a unification around shared Christian values and Christian beliefs, there that the Christian forces that would now exist in Northern Europe, which would eventually expand down into Europe proper in the real timeline and off of the British Isles, would have then had to push down through and would have been working towards pushing back the Islamic forces, not from a starting point essentially after the real Battle of Tours and pushing forces back to being south of the Pyrenees, but really starting in Northern Europe. So if there had been the push to remove Islamic forces by Christian forces subsequent, let's say, to around 800 AD now, beginning, let's say, through the areas that we know as Denmark, coming down from modern Norway and Sweden, is it may have eventually been successful, but it would have started much further north and probably would have taken much more time and would have met with more substantial resistance. Remembering in the real timeline that it wasn't until 1492 that the Moors are finally removed from the Iberian Peninsula. Now imagine the scenario where you're starting much further north with a much more established Islamic caliphate and how long that might have taken. It could have literally been until that same period of time to the 14th, 15th, 16th century before you would have seen the Christian push from the new Christian north in this alternate timeline, pushing down and removing the forces and the empire, the Islamic empire that would have established itself in southern Europe, if they would have been successful at all. And so the Europe that we know today might well have been, at least for the southern part of it, might have been Islamic in its influence. And one of the things that you certainly see from the early spread of Islam, beginning on the Arabian continent again in the early part of the 7th century to the rapid spread, was that, granted, it was often at the tip of a sword, but the radical, rapid spread of Islam is most notable during that 100-year period of time. So if you carry that same concept through, perhaps meeting with different resistance or more resistance in southern Europe, but with similar success, you might have had, again, that much larger unified Islamic caliphate that would have been able to basically encircle the Mediterranean Sea and have established a basis for an empire that could have lasted for hundreds of years. And once you make that change here in the 8th century and allow that to carry forward, that has a tremendous impact on European history moving forward. If you no longer have the Europe of Charlemagne, but you have the Europe of an Islamic version of Charlemagne at the same time, how that flows out through history changes a great deal. The other thing I would say, just particularly about the survival of Christianity and the nature of Christianity under this what-if scenario, is you would have still had the Eastern flavor of Christianity. So the Christianity that had become the norm inside of the Byzantine Empire and centered in Constantinople. And while sharing roots with the Western or Latin version of Christianity, it had evolved into a different form of Christianity in terms of some of its theology, but also in terms of some of its practice. If you look at the Eastern Orthodox versions of the Christian faith today and compare them to just the Catholic Church today, East versus West today, and if you go back historically over time, while they certainly are both Christian and they share a great deal of overlap, and they are legitimately both would recognize each other as being Christian in the broadest sense of that term, the way that expresses itself, the practice, the worship, just some of the theology that exists is very different between the eastern branch of the church in the modern sense and the western branch of the church in the modern sense. And so imagine that the version of Christianity which becomes the majority version of Christianity back during this period of time because of the demise or the diminishment of the Western Latin version of Christianity is the rise of the Eastern version of Christianity. And so most of the Christianity that we would know today under that scenario that would have survived would have been much more influenced and much more leaning towards the Eastern version as we think it today versus the Western version. The implications of that theologically, the religious implications of that are worthy of an episode just to explore that all the way through. But I'm not going to do that now. So we may save that again for another episode another time. But that understanding that Christianity would not have been extinguished by the loss at the Battle of Tours, but it would have been tremendously altered in its form from what most of the Western world knows today. The Western version of Christianity with a Catholic center prior to the Reformation, and the way that that played out through European history and then ultimately through the age of the explorers and the expansion, all of that becomes very different in terms of the way that just the elements of Christianity would have worked. What I really want to focus on, though, and we'll pick this up with next week's episode, is looking at what this change would have meant in the overall flow of history. Again, thinking back to just the one particular event here to sort of plant the seed for where we will pick things up in the next episode, is that it ultimately are two monarchs from two different kingdoms in Spain. That would be Ferdinand and Isabella, who unite Castile and Aragon together, that actually create Spain as we know it, and they unite under. This is now 700 years later. They unite under the banner of the expulsion, finally, of the Islamic influence in the case of the Moors off of the Iberian continent, and, if you will, freeing Europe from Islam. This is 700 years later. But that turns around and leads into the position of Spain in terms of its place with exploration, not even to go down the path of what was going on with Portugal. And then ultimately, of course, what happens as a result of the Reformation and in terms of the situation on the continent between the various elements of Christendom as we go through the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation and the things that happen there. All of those things take their flow out of the religious, political history that harkens back to the survival and the close interplay with Latin Christianity, the Catholic Church, and its connection, for example, to Charlemagne and the Franks, the Holy Roman Empire, all the things that go on there that connect, as I've said before, connect that version of Christianity with the politics of Europe. So if you change that, just changing that is a huge ripple throughout history. I want to explore part of that as we get into the episode next week. The other part to explore next week, though, which I want to look at as being not just the expression of this looking through the eyes of the influence on Christianity, but what it would have meant to have had a much larger, established in Europe, Islamic-centered empire that was in place there, and how that might have also been an interesting change in terms of how things played out with history. So when we pick this topic up in the next episode next week, going to look at both of those particular aspects in a little bit more detail, understanding the long-term implication of the change for the Battle of Tours. So bringing this sort of introduction element to a close here, the short-term change of that more significantly valued Battle of Tours, again, assuming that it's not just that modern historical view of a raiding party that wouldn't have made any difference, but it really was still an invasion force, and the change of the result of there to an Islamic victory for the caliphate versus the Frankish Christian victory under Charles Martel. The short-term implications are pretty obvious. You have the growth and the establishment of more of the Islamic caliphate, not just on the Iberian Peninsula, but on Europe, in the central and western parts of Europe. That's the short-term change, and what we know of as, again, just 70 years later, we don't have the situation where there's a Charlemagne being crowned the Emperor of Rome on Christmas Day in the Basilica of St. Peter's. What instead we have at that point is whatever still exists of the Latin version of Christianity that is now either fighting against or is contained within an expansive Islamic caliphate. You have what's left of Latin Christendom perhaps being contained to Northern Europe, or the strong remnants of it being what exists on the British Isle that has not yet come under the control of the caliphate. And in the near term, you may have the success of Islamic forces in terms of bringing Constantinople to fall literally approximately 700 years earlier than it actually does. And so the short-term implications can be quite profound of that battle in terms of changing the map of Europe, if you will, as we get to AD 800. So that's easy to see in the short term. But again, what we'll pick up with next week's episode is looking at the ways that would have played out long term, both in terms of how things would have worked with the remnants of Christianity, but also with this new European Islamic power and how that might have played moving forward. So I hope that you join us then. So again, this is Don signing off for this episode of A Fork in Time, a little quick solo journey that sets up next week's episode as well. A couple of weeks from now, we're going to return back to some of our themes that were actually contained there towards the end of World War II. We'll have some additional guests on that'll be part of that. So if you like those topics over the last couple of weeks, we're going to be coming back around to them after this little detour going back in time a little bit. But as always, as we close out the show here, I want to say thank you for joining us. I invite you to visit our website, www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Plenty of things to find there, the back catalog, the ability to give us feedback, which we always welcome, the ability to give topic suggestions, and certainly if you'd like to support the shows, the various ways that you can do so through social media, as well as if you're able and willing to do so with financial contributions with links there to our Patreon page. As always, more than anything else, though, we want to thank you not just for finding us, but for giving us some of your time. And so as we close down this episode, I'm going to close it the way we normally do, which is reminding you that if you happen upon a fork in time, our suggestion here from the podcast is that you take it. Talk to you soon.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Learn more about the podcast at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Join us next time.